How old are you? Where are you right now? What is the name of your husband? Imagine for a moment being asked these questions and similar ones. Now imagine being unable to answer them, not having a response. It's not that you can't speak, it's that you genuinely don't know where you are, how old you are, your husband's name. Imagine that as the day goes on, you begin to have trouble identifying objects and events. You mistake pork for spinach, for instance. This reality, this terrifying existence, is precisely the one that Auguste Deter experiences in the early 1900s. Auguste was only 50 when she began to be treated by Dr. Alzheimer, a German psychiatrist. Dr. Alzheimer treated Auguste for 5 years, suspecting a kind of dementia. However, as the years went on, her symptoms got worse, and she eventually passed away at the age of 55. Dr. Alzheimer, however, was determined to find out just what happened to his patient, and requested to study Auguste's brain. What he found was that certain parts of the brain were shrunk, and some had deposits. What he thought were plaques and tangles. Dr. Alzheimer had begun research on one of the most pressing and difficult to treat diseases, Alzheimer's disease, named after him, obviously. Unfortunately, an existence like Auguste's is one that 6.7 million Americans have to live with. Worldwide, the number is 55 million. This is Health Reframed, where we simplify the science of health, break down complex medical concepts, and explore how we can reframe our approach to wellness, focusing on prevention, education, and systemic improvements that empower people to live healthier lives. My name is Jack Snyder. I am a prospective doctor with a degree in biomedical sciences, with a concentration in anatomy and physiology. I'm also an EMT and have worked in healthcare for around 4 years now. As I mentioned, today's topic is Alzheimer's disease. So we're going to talk about exactly what Alzheimer's is, what the risk factors are for it, and if there's anything you can do to prevent or slow down the disease, as well as the future of Alzheimer's and more. To begin, let's break down the science a little bit of Alzheimer's. What happens if you have it, and what are the deeper causes scientifically behind it? According to the Alzheimer's organization, Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia, and dementia refers to a loss of memory and cognitive abilities. Alzheimer's makes up around 60 to 80% of dementia cases, and contrary to popular belief, Alzheimer's is not a normal part of aging. However, age is indeed the biggest risk factor for Alzheimer's. As you get older, your likelihood of getting Alzheimer's increases. So what kind of symptoms does Alzheimer's have? What do patients or individuals with Alzheimer's present with? So Alzheimer's seems to affect memory in a significant way, with symptoms worsening over time. Early symptoms may cause difficulty in learning new information. However, more severe symptoms can be present in those with Alzheimer's, including disorientation, confusion about what time and place they are in, suspicions around those around them, difficulty speaking, and even difficulty moving and walking. All of these symptoms severely impact independence and impair the degree to which the person can be independent and live on their own. Some of these symptoms can be normal with aging. After all, who doesn't have the occasional memory slip? And as you get older, this can be more common. But what really sets Alzheimer's apart is its severity. The degree to which the memory and other cognitive functions suffer is normally clear to those around someone with Alzheimer's, even if the person with Alzheimer's denies anything being wrong. A proper diagnosis, will of course require certain tests like an MRI and a more comprehensive neurological examination, to be sure. So, 2 of my grandparents actually developed dementia. I'm not 100% sure if it was Alzheimer's, but it is possible, but it was at least dementia. And watching the slow decline is something that's hard on a family, and it was hard on me individually. Not being recognized by a family member, someone you've known your entire life, who you've spent your childhood with, or being recognized as someone else, hearing them talk about being somewhere else. These are some of the realities of Alzheimer's, and it makes having family members with the disease a very difficult process to work through. The symptoms, unlike other diseases, affect the mind in such a way that a person who you've known for a very, very long time is now a rather different person, or at least that's the way it seems. And it changes your relationship with them and how you interact with them in virtually every way. However, I think coming to an understanding of the disease, how it works, it can help, at least to a degree, on how you navigate this challenge and the change that they experience and that you experience by proxy. So let's get into how Alzheimer's works. It's a disease that unsurprisingly affects the brain, but how exactly does this happen? How does it affect the brain? As many of you know, the brain is a very delicate organ in the body, and it requires very special conditions to function properly. Any slight change can make a noticeable difference. Think about a concussion. You can get hit in the head with a degree of severity, and it can severely impact how your brain works, especially for shorter periods of time after the concussion. The brain consists of around 100 billion neurons, and they're intricately connected, and certain areas serve different functions. There's a lot of pathways, a lot of circuits, very similar to an electrical circuit. The brain indeed does work with electricity, though it's not exactly how a computer works, it is still electricity. However, it is important to note that although some brain areas tend to have specific functions, like you have areas that are thought to be have a function of understanding language, there's a great deal of variation in this. This is likely because the wiring can be different and likely requires on many parts of the brain. For instance, the area of the brain that's related to language is connected to many, many other areas of the brain. And if this area gets affected, it's going to affect different things. And if another area gets affected, it still may affect language understanding. Anyways, back to Alzheimer's. It affects the brain by causing a buildup or loss of brain matter that should not be there. So let's get into exactly what that means. As I mentioned earlier, the two most well-known factors when discussing Alzheimer's are plaques and tangles. So your body produces many complicated molecules to do many things. I'm going to break down exactly what these plaques and tangles are. And many of these molecules are proteins. Proteins are found in meats. You may have protein powder, and these proteins are broken down into basic building blocks when you eat them. And these building blocks are amino acids. From here, your body converts these amino acids into full-on proteins. And the proteins serve many, many different functions in the body, and the shape of the protein often determines the function. So today we're going to talk about two such proteins, beta-amyloid proteins and tau proteins. So we're going to start with beta-amyloid, and it is thought that they accumulate in the space between neurons. So your brain produces beta-amyloid, and it clumps together, if you want to think about it like that, in the area between neurons. So your brain, much of it is composed of neurons, but there is space in between them, and there's other cells that aren't neurons specifically in the brain. It's thought that these beta-amyloid proteins get outside of the cells and clump together. And as they accumulate over time, they begin to impair the ability of the neurons that they are close to work properly. These plaques can cause damage to neurons in certain areas of the brain, specifically the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory. They can also accumulate in the amygdala and the cerebral cortex. These are areas of the brain that are associated with emotions. The amygdala is associated with emotions, and the cerebral cortex is associated with higher order brain function. All that's to say, if these plaques accumulate in these areas, they slowly cause damage to these areas, and they impair the function of these areas. So they're going to impair memory, they're going to affect emotions, and they're going to impair higher order brain function. Furthermore, these so-called beta-amyloid plaques cannot be broken down by the body, making them especially dangerous. The other protein that is of interest is the tau protein. Like the beta-amyloid protein, the tau protein causes damage by accumulating where it shouldn't be. However, the difference here is that whereas beta-amyloid accumulates between the cells, between the neurons, the tau protein accumulates inside of cells, forming neurofibrillary tangles. They get tangled up, these proteins. You can almost think of them like strings that get folded in such a way that they form their correct function, and then they can get tangled together, or they can clump together. And the proteins, these tau proteins, they get twisted around each other, forming microscopic strings inside of the cells. And if enough of these accumulate, the cell starts to not function properly. And naturally, this is going to cause damage to the neurons that it affects. Finally, Alzheimer's can be caused not by the aggregation of something that shouldn't be there, but by losing something that should be there. Damage and loss of neurons in the neocortex and the limbic system is normally seen in early stage Alzheimer's. The neocortex is responsible for language, movement, and decision making, whereas the limbic system is the part of your brain responsible for emotion. Loss of these neurons or damage to them can cause many of the symptoms associated with Alzheimer's. So let's summarize all of that a little bit. The brain is very delicate and very particular. Adding or subtracting even a little can cause it to stop functioning properly. Buildup of the beta-amyloid or tau proteins, either inside or outside of the cells respectively, can lead to brain dysfunction, causing the symptoms of Alzheimer's. This is called the amyloid hypothesis. Furthermore, damage or loss of cells in the brain can cause similar effects. Alzheimer's can also be broken down into a few categories. Early onset Alzheimer's occurs between the ages of 30 and 65 years old. However, it is very rare. Early onset Alzheimer's is thought to be caused by inheritance. So you inherit certain genes that cause the Alzheimer's to start to spring up earlier in life. The second kind of Alzheimer's is late onset Alzheimer's, and this occurs when the disease begins to appear over the age of 65. Both types are more likely in people who have a family history of Alzheimer's, and we'll get into that in a little while. But what actually causes all of this happen in the first place? Well, unfortunately, this is where we hit a bit of a wall. Scientists are still a little uncertain as to what causes these proteins to accumulate. We know that they do accumulate, and they do likely cause many of the symptoms and effects of Alzheimer's, but why they accumulate in the first place is still a bit of a mystery. And this makes Alzheimer's a very prominent area of research. Though we aren't entirely sure, there are a few theories that may shed some light on the disease. And that's what we're going to talk about next. Since we've discussed what Alzheimer's is, let's kind of break down more of the causes of these protein aggregations and the risk factors that are associated with it. As we just discussed, the cause of Alzheimer's is thought to be linked with abnormal accumulation of proteins in the brain, as well as loss of important neurons. However, the exact reason for these is not known. Furthermore, we are also not entirely sure if this hypothesis holds salt. And the reason for this is that the accumulation of the beta-amyloid and tau proteins occurs in normal, healthy brains, as well as the brains of individuals with Alzheimer's. So, does this mean the entire hypothesis, the so-called amyloid hypothesis, is wrong? After all, as normal, healthy people age, we do accumulate these proteins. Well, not exactly. Alzheimer's is generally split up into inherited and non-inherited. Inherited Alzheimer's, as the name suggests, is Alzheimer's that occurs due to inherited traits, often specific gene mutations. Non-inherited Alzheimer's, by contrast, occurs without a clear genetic reason. So, as before, we talked about the amyloid hypothesis, and this is the aggregation of the proteins we've been talking about. And it accounts mostly for inherited Alzheimer's. Let me explain. This is due to the fact that mutations of certain genes are linked to Alzheimer's. Some of these genes impact beta-amyloid production and breakdown. So the logic goes, people with Alzheimer's have these genetic mutations, right? And these mutations affect the beta-amyloid proteins. Therefore, Alzheimer's is likely a disease that has something to do with beta-amyloid proteins. Many of these genes will impact how the beta-amyloid proteins aggregate. They may cause the aggregation to be more likely, or for the breakdown to be less likely, for instance. Another hypothesis about the origin of Alzheimer's is called the cholinergic hypothesis. This explanation is going to be a bit science-heavy, but I think it's important when we talk about the treatments a little later. In your brain, as we mentioned, you have neurons. And these neurons talk to each other, in a sense, by connecting and releasing chemicals. So one neuron will send out a long projection called an axon, and this axon will synapse. That's the term we call when the axon connects to the cell body of another neuron. The axon and cell body will synapse, And at this synapse, neurotransmitters are released. So axon 1 or neuron 1 will release neurotransmitters at the end of its axon, and these neurotransmitters will affect neuron number 2. And there's many kinds of neurotransmitters, and they do separate things, and oftentimes it has a lot less to do with the specific neurotransmitter and about the neuron that the neurotransmitter is landing on, if you will. However, there are general patterns with neurotransmitters, but that's a bit of a tangent. The neurotransmitter we're talking about today is called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is important for processes involving memory, learning, and other critical aspects of brain function. However, neurons that release acetylcholine can be damaged by beta-amyloid protein aggregation. This means that these neurons do not produce as much acetylcholine and therefore do not function properly. In a word, beta-amyloid causes some neurons to not function properly, namely ones that release acetylcholine. So the hypothesis here is that the beta-amyloid proteins impact these neurons negatively, and they don't release acetylcholine, which is the final location of the dysfunction. Because if they're not releasing the neurotransmitter, then the effect that they elicit or intend to elicit doesn't actually happen as well. So these are the two prominent working hypotheses about Alzheimer's. However, what are some things we know that are linked to Alzheimer's and the development of the disease? As I mentioned earlier, the biggest risk factor here is aging. Most Alzheimer's cases start after the age of 65. Aging is a very complicated process that affects virtually every cell in the body, and as you age, your brain decreases in size and degrades as time goes on. This can make it difficult to tell Alzheimer's from normal aging, at least for early cases. Another risk factor that is very important to note is genetics. As many of you know, your body contains genetic code, the DNA, that holds the blueprint for your body. It contains information on how to build everything from the most basic protein to an entire organ and your whole body as a whole. However, these genes can be slightly altered or they can change over time, causing different things to be produced. Often these changes are harmless. Many of them have actually no effect whatsoever. Some of them have positive effects. Some of them just have different effects. Certain mutations can be like the difference between blue eyes and green eyes, for instance. However, some of these changes can be negative. They can negatively impact how well your body functions. And certain genetic mutations have been linked to Alzheimer's, meaning that people with these mutations are more likely to have Alzheimer's. In fact, 70% of Alzheimer's cases were associated with genetic factors. Many of these mutations are related to the beta-amyloid proteins we talked about earlier. They have effects like increasing the likelihood that certain forms of beta-amyloid form, certain kinds of this protein, if you will, are more likely to clump together than others. And some people have genetic mutations that cause the stickier ones to form more often. They also have impacts, the genetic mutations have impacts like decreasing the number of beta-amyloid being removed. So if you're not removing as much, more is going to clump together. Many genes have been studied to get a better idea of what causes Alzheimer's as well as how to be able to treat it. If we can understand exactly what causes it, especially at the genetic level, we may actually be able to develop ways of slowing or reversing altogether Alzheimer's. And this is something we're going to talk about a little later. Beyond genetics, which is unfortunately out of your control, as well as age, can't slow down time, there are some factors that are correlated with Alzheimer's that are more under your control. So let's talk about those. Certain air pollutants have been thought to be linked to Alzheimer's, increasing beta-amyloid clumping. And diet also seems to play a relatively significant role in developing Alzheimer's. Diets rich in antioxidants, fish, and vitamins, the normal foods we think of as healthy foods, are associated with a lower risk for Alzheimer's. Whereas a high-calorie diet and a diet high in fats were found to increase the risk of Alzheimer's. Malnutrition as well, not getting enough nutrients, vitamins, minerals, etc., is also associated with Alzheimer's. This goes back to a big thing I talk about a lot on this channel. Diet and exercise as well are huge factors that really impact almost every area of health. So improving diet, I would say diet especially, can help fight against many, if not all, of the negative medical conditions that we talk about on this show. Beyond those, rattle off a couple more here. Significant exposure to metals like aluminum and lead can increase the risk of Alzheimer's. Another knock for lead there. Lead just really isn't good for you. Certain infections can increase the risk for Alzheimer's, such as herpes simplex virus and chlamydia. And finally, certain medical conditions, namely cardiovascular disease, obesity, and diabetes, are associated with Alzheimer's. This, again, goes back to our discussion on diet and exercise, as these chronic conditions can be tampered or brought to be under better control with diet and exercise. Thankfully, though, the last few factors that I mentioned here are under your control. You can actually do something about them. You can try to avoid air pollution if possible. I know that can be difficult. You can change your diet. You can limit exposure to metals where you know that you might be being exposed to them. Exercise, avoiding infections. All of these things are correlated with a decreased risk in Alzheimer's, and they're under your control, which I think is good news, as you do have some autonomy in the matter. So as we just talked about, there are certain lifestyle factors that can be altered to help lower the risk of Alzheimer's. So let's kind of break those down a little bit further. Improvement of cardiovascular health seems to be a very big factor for more than just Alzheimer's as well. Cardiovascular health impacts virtually everything in the body. I got more in depth on some of the topics we're going to go into here on my episode for hypertension. So if you want to hear a little bit more, or go a little bit more deeper into this topic, you can listen to that episode. However, there are some general good rules of thumb when it comes to improving cardiovascular health. Reducing salt intake is a big one, as this raises blood pressure significantly. Furthermore, having a healthy diet, one consisting of fruits, vegetables, lean meat, low-fat dairy products, and limiting processed foods, works phenomenally well in improving health, beyond just cardiovascular health. Exercise is also important. This can be cardio, weightlifting, or literally just walking every day, going on a short 10-minute walk, or parking a little further away at the grocery store. Things to just improve or make more common exercise that you get in the day works wonders for heart health and health in general. With regards to obesity and diabetes, at least type 2 diabetes, much of the same advice applies. If you're interested in the exercise aspect of things, I did an episode on this as well that you can check out. And I will surely make an episode on diet, or maybe a series. Diet is a pretty big topic, and I want to make sure I do it justice. So I'll probably make an episode or a series on that sometime soon as well. So look out for that. So I know these changes are very common recommendations. They're hammered in kind of ad nauseum, and the problem with them is that they can be hard changes for really anyone to make. And I understand that I can sound like a broken record. Diet, exercise, right? But it really is something that I harp on so much in this show for a reason. It seems that with most, if not all, medical conditions, improvement and or prevention of the medical condition can be achieved with lifestyle changes. Alzheimer's, in my opinion, is a very stark example of this, because this is a disease that is so often talked about and one that we're kind of in the dark on in many ways. Yet we still know that a healthy lifestyle improves your odds with it. So even though there's still a lot of mysteries around it, a lot that we don't know, we do know that a healthy lifestyle helps. But beyond lifestyle changes, what is the state of affairs with the research and with the medications for Alzheimer's? We often hear about Alzheimer's research being very important, and they're trying to come out with medications and different treatments for it. So where are we with that? Well, unfortunately, we don't have a perfect cure at the moment, but like I said, there's a lot of research going into this, tackling the issue from many different fronts. So let's discuss some of that. So we'll start with a couple drugs here. The first class is called cholinesterase inhibitors. So if you remember our conversation earlier about the cholinergic hypothesis, let's kind of refresh that because it's very important here. So it is thought that one of the ways Alzheimer's causes cognitive decline is because some neurons in the brain stop producing as much acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter, a chemical that some neurons use to talk to each other. In these neurons, acetylcholine is released outside of the neuron and floats to the other neuron. It gets released from the axon of neuron 1. It floats across the synapse, which is a little space in between the axons, in between the neurons, and it attaches to the second neuron on the cell body, or another projection off of the cell body. However, after this happens, the acetylcholine has to be broken down. So it attaches to the second neuron, and then it doesn't actually get absorbed into the neuron. So it disattaches, I suppose. It breaks off of the neuron, and it has to get back into the first neuron. And this happens through a molecule called cholinesterase. It's a enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine and brings it back into the first neuron. And it is basically recycled, if you want to think about it like that. And cholinesterase inhibitors prevent this from happening. Now, this may be a little confusing. We're introducing a double negative into the conversation. Double negatives are very common in neurobiology. So what these drugs do is they inhibit the neurons from breaking down the acetylcholine. So this means that there's actually more acetylcholine available. If you have the acetylcholine hanging out in the synapse and then it's broken down regularly, it's not going to be there very long. But if you prevent it from being broken down, it's going to be there longer and it's going to be able to elicit more of an effect. And this means that there's actually more acetylcholine available. So in a word, less breakdown of acetylcholine equals more acetylcholine. And this more acetylcholine means that these neurons actually end up functioning better or more similar to how they would under normal conditions. This class of drugs is useful in treating the symptoms of Alzheimer's, but unfortunately does not cure or reverse it. That said, the reduction of symptoms is still a big step and can make a big difference in the patient's lives and the lives of their families. Another class of drugs are monoclonal antibodies that target the beta-amyloid clusters. So I know that sounds like a bunch of gobbledygook, a big mouthful, but let's break it down here. In your body, you have an immune system that works to fight off infections and foreign invaders to your body. One way that it does this is by detecting foreign things, generally bacteria or viruses, with antibodies. And these are small proteins that stick to certain targets. So an antibody will be able to detect a virus, for instance, and stick to it, which helps destroy it and tells the immune system, hey, let's get rid of this thing. Certain cells, white blood cells, see the antibodies and they target the viruses for destruction. Basically, the antibodies are like a sign saying, get rid of me, on whatever they're attached to. We can actually use this to our advantage in some cases, beyond Alzheimer's as well, but we're specifically talking about that today, if we are able to engineer antibodies that stick to what we want. And you may be able to see where this is going. A monoclonal antibody refers to an antibody that is made in the lab. And there are currently a good number of Alzheimer's drugs that are monoclonal antibodies in clinical research trials. And there are two that have been approved for use: donanemab and lecanemab. These drugs end in MAB, which stands for monoclonal antibodies. These drugs target the beta-amyloid proteins, the beta-amyloid plaques, that we talked about earlier, signaling to the immune system that it should remove these clumps of protein. So the monoclonal antibody sticks to the beta-amyloid plaques, and then the immune system comes in and pretty much eats them all up. And if you remove the beta-amyloid clumps, you can reverse Alzheimer's, or at least this is the hope. Unfortunately, none of these kinds of drugs have been shown to definitively cure Alzheimer's, but they certainly offer a promising horizon. Another area of study for drugs targets protein folding. What exactly do I mean by protein folding, though? So, as we discussed earlier, Alzheimer's is thought to be caused in large part by aggregation of proteins, namely the beta-amyloid and the tau proteins. Proteins are made up of building blocks called amino acids, as we said earlier, and these amino acids are linked together to form a chain of sorts. This chain, due to various reasons inside of the cell that we don't have to get into today, literally folds into the right shape inside the cell. A protein must fold into a specific shape, otherwise it won't work. You can't just have the string of amino acids and have it work. It has to fold into the right shape, almost like a tool. So these tools, the proteins, are used for specific functions inside of the cell, and if it's not the right shape, it won't perform the correct function. It would be like fitting a square peg into a circular hole, if you want to think of it like that. This process of protein folding normally happens without a hitch in cells. The protein is produced, by the ribosomes, if you've heard of those. And as it exits the ribosome, it begins folding literally as soon as it's starting to exit, and then it folds into the right shape, and it goes off and does whatever it's supposed to do. However, they can sometimes fold into the wrong shape. And sometimes, if they fold into the wrong shape, this can make them a lot more likely to clump together with proteins that are the same. So one beta-amyloid folds incorrectly, and then this causes other beta-amyloids to also fold incorrectly and stick together. This is one of the ways that beta-amyloid and tau proteins can clump together and cause Alzheimer's. There are multiple ways that scientists are currently looking at to tackle this angle of protein folding to improve Alzheimer's. One way that they're doing this is by looking into so-called chaperones. Some of you may have heard the word chaperone. Often we think about parents going on a field trip to watch over the kids, right? But in the cell, a chaperone is a protein, another protein, that helps other proteins fold properly. The idea is that if we can engineer chaperones that make sure the beta-amyloid and tau proteins fold correctly, we can help prevent or reverse Alzheimer's. This is because if they fold properly, they may not clump together. Other therapies include development of drugs that prevent the destruction of neurons, drugs that slow or prevent the production of beta-amyloid in the first place, and drugs that reduce inflammation. As I mentioned earlier, scientists are really considering all the ways that they can attack this problem and hopefully find a cure to Alzheimer's. One of the reasons for this is that it is expected that over the next few decades, the number of people with Alzheimer's is going to quadruple. So it's going to become a much bigger problem in the future. And naturally, this makes the problem that much more relevant. Finally, scientists have also looked into natural therapeutics to see if they can help Alzheimer's in conjunction with traditional Western medicine. Surprisingly, nicotine was the first chemical to be researched to see if it could help Alzheimer's. Marijuana and traditional Chinese medicine have also been researched. Surprisingly, they do show some promise. Marijuana has been shown to promote beta-amyloid degradation. So the theory is marijuana helps your body clear the beta-amyloid plaques more efficiently. Other compounds in traditional medicines have also been shown to reduce the formation of the beta-amyloid clusters in the first place. This may sound disjointed and like we are treading water. It's like we're maybe not getting anywhere. We're trying to throw the kitchen sink at it. And this is kind of the case. We have been trying a lot of different things, but the bright side here is that throughout the years, we have made progress and we have had breakthroughs that have shown promise. One such breakthrough is using AI, actually, to analyze conditions like blood work or even eye movements to detect Alzheimer's early. Early detection is super important because if we can identify Alzheimer's earlier, we can start treating it and hopefully slow down the symptoms. And with the advent of AI, this process might even get more efficient and more accurate in the following years. There are many angles that scientists and doctors are taking with Alzheimer's. It is one of the most pressing areas of research and could hold many breakthroughs that improve Alzheimer's outcomes and even shed light on other neurodegenerative diseases. A few things seem to be of utmost importance, though. Being aware of symptoms to catch the disease early and begin early treatment, working to improve lifestyle and fostering this for the majority of people, and continuing to research to find an effective and strong treatment. That said, whether it is through lifestyle changes, engineered antibodies, or natural medicines, I think there's a lot to be hopeful for in the future of Alzheimer's. So we've talked a lot about the science of Alzheimer's, what we're doing to treat it, how it works, and all of that stuff. But I think what can be equally important to talk about is how to actually interact with someone who has Alzheimer's. Maybe you have a family member, or perhaps you work in a palliative care community and you have many patients who have Alzheimer's. And someone with Alzheimer's can be a very difficult person to approach and relate to. It can seem like the gap in perception, the gap in time, the differences can just be too much. This, along with the fact that the patient may often have a difficult time with memory and time perception, can make relating and communicating quite a challenge. However, I believe that we should see the common humanity in everyone, and even if there are differences in how we see the world, or even experience time in reality, I think it's important that we see this humanity and try to foster a relationship and really try to make the most of how we interact with the other person. So caring for and interacting with Alzheimer's patients or family members is admittedly different than how you interact with other people. The nature of Alzheimer's means that the interactions have to be of a different kind, but not necessarily a different quality. By this, I mean that although you may have to change how you approach someone with Alzheimer's, you can still maintain important values that you approach really anyone with. Love, compassion, understanding, and even a desire for them to find meaning can all still be ways that you interact with someone with Alzheimer's. Some organizations specialized in treating dementia refer to person-centered care, which is a concept derived by Carl Rogers. According to Rogers, we should care for our patient and approach personal interactions in a way that is based on authentic communication and authentic connection. In this way, we can truly open the common humanity between us. If you're being genuine, that invites them to be genuine. And even though you might have different experiences or, like I said, different ways of experiencing time and even reality, if you can share that common humanity and that authenticity, I think it can make the interaction and the connection a lot more meaningful. And humans desire this connection so deeply. People with Alzheimer's do as well. It's so much of a cliche, humans are social creatures, as we say. And this longing is still there in Alzheimer's patients. So I think it's really important to foster this sense of connectedness and community and love and care and all of that, right? And there's actually a couple guidelines here on how to care for patients with dementia. And here's some of them. Attending to the whole person, seeing the individual as special, unique, focusing on the positives, staying in communication, maximizing freedom and minimizing control, making sure that you give to them, but also you receive. Many people enjoy giving, Alzheimer's patients included. If the Alzheimer's patient wants to give you something, their time, who knows what, accept it. I think that makes the bond that much more real and that much more meaningful. Another facet of care for Alzheimer's patients is maintaining personhood for the individual. Often, the person's sense of self remains intact with dementia, but what can impact this is the differing interactions that they have. So they still have their sense of self, but all the interactions that they have are likely changing if they have Alzheimer's. The family might act differently. They might be in a hospital or palliative care facility. And all this can be a lot to take in and might be very confusing, especially, again, with the change of memory and the change of time. And this is why I think it's important to interact with Alzheimer's patients as an individual. See them as a person, even if the setting and the differences are still there, you can still treat them as your grandmother or your grandfather or your patient. This can be difficult in healthcare with staff turnover, shift changes, etc., but I think it's something that family members can truly, really strive for, even though it may be difficult. And this difficulty is very real. After all, it may be the case that someone who you once knew very well is a very different person. I think what all these values and philosophies have in common, though, is really to empathize with the person. Talk to them about what they want to talk about. Bring up the positive things that are going on in the moment, in the now, but also bring up the positives of their past. See if you can bring up positive interactions that you have had with them before. I think it's also important to keep in contact. Don't forget about them. They might be changed and in a different facility, in a different place, but I think for them, knowing that they have family members that still care about them and still make the effort to be in contact is huge. As well as social relationships, making sure that, friends, family, all of the people that they care about are still in contact with them. And people with Alzheimer's are also still meaning-oriented. Nurturing what they find meaningful can be another step towards providing care and interacting with them in a way that fosters their mental health and I think helps them continue to live a meaningful and happy life. And whatever that may be, just helping to bring the meaning into their life wherever you can. Unfortunately, there isn't really a one-size-fits-all philosophy of how to be with someone with Alzheimer's, but I think it can kind of be boiled down into recognizing their value, their innate value as a fellow human, and fostering what is best for your relationship with them and what's best for them. Today, we looked at Alzheimer's. This disease is one of the most talked about nowadays because of how much researchers are trying to find a cure. We took a look at what causes Alzheimer's, as well as a few theories of why it happens. The process involves clumping or tangling together of proteins in the brain, specifically beta-amyloid and tau proteins. These proteins cause the brain to stop functioning properly, leading to symptoms associated with Alzheimer's, namely disorientation, memory loss, and loss of cognitive functions. We looked at what are some causes and risk factors, the big ones being age and genetics. Lifestyle choices like diet and exercise certainly play a role, as they reduce the likelihood of cardiovascular disease, obesity, and diabetes, all of these being within your control. However, there is still much that is unknown about the exact causes of Alzheimer's. We looked at what is currently being done in the way of treating Alzheimer's. Lifestyle is certainly something that can be addressed, but there are also many drugs and pharmacological therapeutics being explored. There isn't a cure yet, but there are many people working on the problem with some promising leads, so there is certainly hope for the future. Finally, we talked about relating to and interacting with people with Alzheimer's. Though it can be difficult, embracing the shared humanity and finding ways to make the relationship as meaningful as possible is important. Much has changed since the early 1900s when Alzheimer's was first identified by Dr. Alzheimer, and the future likely holds many impressive changes still. Thank you all for listening today. I hope you found this podcast interesting. I hope you learned something today. And as always, I'll include the sources I used for further reading, and I'll put those in the show notes. Share and save the podcast if you enjoyed it. I hope you all have a great day and can't wait to see you for the next episode.